That famous voice, thank you. So just to reiterate, welcome to Dharma Breeze, our Wednesday night service held by the Ekoji Buddhist Temple. And again, this is for us to be able to hear the Dharma midweek and hopefully give us some energy to get through the rest of the week. The format is shortened. We have a very short service at the beginning. Then there will be a Dharma talk that I will give on the subject matter. And this week it's on compassion. And then we will do a reading and then we'll go into the discussion group. At the time that the discussion group starts, then we will stop the recording for people's privacy. So today, what I would like to do is I would like to start with silent meditation. So if you could please join me in sitting up straight and putting your hands on the lap. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats. So before I start my Dharma talk, I would just like to point out, because I see that very nicely we have some people that weren't with us last week. I'm actually sitting here in the New York Buddhist Church of New York. This is where I'm the resident minister, then this is the parsonage. And as you can see, the beautiful Obutsudan behind me. And as I pointed out last week, this is not a projection. This is actually a real Obutsudan, which I'm very fortunate to be able to have in the parsonage. So it's a great backdrop, but as I said last week, I know that the etiquette is I'm not supposed to have my back to the Buddha, but I think Shinran would understand for this session. So what I'd like us to do next is I would like us to chant the Jusei Ge, and if you see the link on the side, it'll be on page 93, again, for the Jusei Ge. So please join me. Namadats, 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 namadats. Gagon Josegan Ishi Mujodo Shigan Fumanzok Seifu Joshogak Gao Muryoko Fui Dai Seishu Usai Shobingu Seifu Joshogak Gashi Jobundo Myosho Chojipo Kukyo Mishomon Seifu Joshogak Ryoku Jinshonen Joe Shubongyo しぐむ浄土、一生天人師、人力現代公、不詳無才道、少女三苦妙、交際集約難、会意知恵言、滅死公務案、永息小悪道、通達全宗門、高僧上満足、いよろじぽ、日月主十期、天候音符言、一種解放像、法世功徳を、上大集中、説法四式、供養一切仏、具足修徳音、元年出上満、得意三害を、如仏無下知、通達未不詳、願学営力、投資最小損、志願若果、大仙大感動、国小天人、東宇妙見、なまな、な、なぶ、なま、なぶ、なま、なぶ、なま、なぶ、な、なぶ、万にしくどく、平等聖祭、道本菩提心、往生、あー、お、Namdats, Namadats, 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 Namadats. Thank you. I don't know if all of you heard or saw my technical difficulty. I forgot to put my cat into the back bedroom. And when I start to chant, especially when it comes to the Nembutsu, she thinks I'm in pain. So she actually jumped up on the table and was like trying to get on my lap in the middle of the chanting. So if it looked like I was doing animal abuse, I was just simply putting her on the floor. So I think the sound filter is probably drowning her out right now, which is probably a good thing. So, so like I said, one of the points that we're doing with Dharma Breeze is that this is a little bit more interactive than a typical Sunday service. And again, I would like to emphasize that Ekoji is holding a service every Sunday in person and virtually. And this is to augment that for people that maybe would not be able to attend that service. So the meaning or the thought behind it is that we focus on one subject. And today, like I said, we're going to be talking about compassion, or as in the Buddhist sense of compassion. We had an Eastern District meeting last week, last Saturday virtually. And as you know, there are 4 temples in the Eastern District. There's Ekoji, there's the the New York Buddhist Temple, there's Seabrook, and then there's the Midwest Temple. And it was a real eye-opener because when I was on the Zoom session, I realized, oh, I supervised 3 out of these 4 temples. I'm like, it was a very realistic moment for me. But part of that is that I realized is that all of the temples, whether it's in the East Coast or whether it's in California or whether it's in Japan, they all have their own distinct personality, which I think is a strength. So I love being in New York. The types of questions I get asked in New York and at Ekoji are sometimes very academic and very philosophically oriented. And there's other times where I'll go to a country temple and people will be asking more basic questions about, for example, what is the Buddha? When I served in the Fresno, when I first started, there were 6 temples within a 45-minute driving radius of Fresno. And they were all different. There was 2 temples, Parlier and Reedley. They're less than 6 miles apart, a 10-minute drive. And they have such different personalities. They tried to merge several times over the years, and they just couldn't do it. So that shows you how the Sangha makes the temple have a certain type of personality. And I've always enjoyed working with Ekoji because people do ask very good questions. And one of the questions that keeps coming up throughout the time when I taught the basic Buddhist class and the Jodo Shinshu class is the idea of language. Especially for those that might be new to Buddhism, you go into the bookstore or the library, you go online and you pick up a book, and it's like, well, you might not be aware, but it might be a Tibetan book and all the Buddhist terminology is in Tibetan. Or you might pick up a Zen book and there's a bunch of Buddhist terminology in Japanese, which is not the same as our Jodo Shinshu. And I have to give people credit because I know that the first 2 or 3 years when I started reading Buddhist books, I pick up a book and I think, oh, I kind of understand this book. And then I pick up another book and I'm like, well, wait a minute, this book is really different from that book and I don't understand why. And part of it is because, as we mentioned, there's many different schools of Buddhism. And so how they express the teachings, and that includes language, can be different. So as I mentioned in my basic introduction to Buddhist class, is that we just have to remember that the Dharma, when Shakyamuni Buddha died over 2,500 years in what is now India and Nepal, when the teachings left the country, they weren't stagnant. And so the idea that the Buddhism that first went to Sri Lanka, which is the Theravada school of Buddhism, the oldest existing school, they had their language and customs. But then when it started going through Southeast Asia, and especially when it hit China, there's a lot of linguistic changes for that and the meanings of the words. For those of you that have an understanding basically about what Chinese and Japanese is, you know that they utilize characters that represent concepts. So the average Japanese high school student is supposed to know both alphabets, hiragana and katakana, both have over 80 characters. And then to be literate, you have to know 2,000 characters. On a side note, Ken, you'll probably find this interesting that both doctors in Japan and Buddhist monks are supposed to average between 4,000 and 5,000 kanji characters, right? And as I said, it's interesting because my Japanese is very limited. When I went to seminary at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, we did learn kanji. And when you look at the kanji, it has all these different nuances. So you can read it and you can say, well, the character means this. And so there's this depth of the Dharma that I'm envious of, like Reverend Hayashi and other native Japanese speakers have. But here we are, here we are in the modern era. We are at Ekoji Buddhist Temple. Most of us don't have that knowledge of Japanese, and nor do we have to have that knowledge, because the idea is that the Dharma is timeless. This has come up in every temple that I've gone to. Now I've gone to a service at all 3 temples that I supervise, including Seabrook. And the idea about the Dharma being timeless has really come up with the different discussions. And they talk about, the idea of that, I actually had a person ask me point blank, well, do you have to speak or read Japanese to understand Jodo Shinshu Buddhism? And my answer was no. Probably other Japanese ministers might not agree with that, but for us, this is what we are given. And we're very fortunate to have Ekoji both as a physical temple and also Ekoji in the virtual Sangha, where we can get together and hear in a language that we can understand. So one of the things that's also important is that there are schools of Buddhism that believe that the human words or the human languages impedes our understanding the essence of Buddhism. So I think many of us might be familiar with what the Japanese Zen schools of Buddhism, where people go into deep meditation. And then they try not to they don't do as many lectures. The idea is that they receive the transmission of the Dharma through their practice and through the samadhi, like Shakyamuni Buddha did when he sat under the Bodhi tree over 2,500 years ago. And so they'll say, especially like, well, you say words, and when you use words, then your mind gets distracted. And I can understand that. Supposedly, one of the famous motifs that they use in Japanese Buddhism is the finger pointing to the moon. It's actually from the Zen tradition. And so the story goes is that there were two people and it was the full moon. So for those of you that are interested in Japanese culture, the full moon is the most radiant in the Northern Hemisphere in September. And a lot of Buddhist schools will have a special ceremony around it. I practice the Yabanochi school of tea, and there's a very special viewing ceremony in tea where you actually time it. So then when you finish the ceremony, you open up the doors and then you can look at the full moon. It's absolutely a wonderful experience. But the story goes is that these two monks were talking to each other, and he goes, well, you know, it's the full moon. And the one monk says, well, what do you mean it's the full moon? He says, well, look at it, it's right there, it's the moon. And so the other monk was staring at the other monk's finger. He goes, I don't see anything, it's just a finger. He goes, no, the moon, you know, up in the sky. And this is a metaphor, a way of explaining that so many times we get caught up in our everyday practice or the words or the meaning where the Dharma is beyond those conceptual ideas. And so the idea of like the finger pointing to the moon is not the finger, it's the moon itself. Now, for getting back to this idea of talking about compassion today, one of the things I'd like to point out is that most of us, not all of us, but most of us were born and raised as native English speakers. And even though some of you have been fortunate enough to have been raised in the Buddhist tradition, a lot of us haven't. A lot of us, myself included, I was raised as a Christian. And so when you hear words like prayer and faith, it carries a lot of baggage for me. So when I'm reading a Buddhist text and it says, when we have faith in the Buddha, I can't help but think of my Christian upbringing where faith has a very different connotation and feeling to it. So for us, beyond the idea of not knowing Japanese or Pali or Sanskrit or all these languages, we have to also realize when we're reading and studying the Dharma that the words in English, we have to be mindful about not taking them in the literal, secular, everyday sense. And as I said last week when we were talking about mindful practice, it's the idea of thinking about it in the Buddhist realm or thinking outside of our everyday life and how we conceptualize things. And so actually the idea is that we'll be talking about in Shin Buddhism, Shinran specifically calls it great compassion. He doesn't talk about compassion because this is a compassion that is beyond what we would deal with in our everyday life. My first Dharma talk here at New York was very intimidating because it was on the anniversary of 9/11. And a lot of the Sangha had lived through 9/11, lost family members. And so I was living in Seattle at the time that 9/11 happened. And like a lot of us, it was such a traumatic event. I purposely, stopped reading articles on it many, many years ago. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to be giving a talk about the 9/11 memorial to New Yorkers, I need to refresh my memory. And I'll tell you, reading those stories 20 years later still brought tears to my eyes. It was very emotional what people went through. And I won't go into great detail, but there was one story that specifically touched me where there were, for a lot of, to jar your memory, so underneath the train, the Twin Towers, there was a shopping center that I think it was 2 or maybe even 3 stories deep. So you would come out of the building and you would go into the shopping center and there'd be all the stores. And a lot of people that survived the falling of the towers were actually in that shopping center underground. But then what happened is when the towers fell on the structure. And so it was total chaos. It was total darkness. The dust that we're all remember from the photographs is permeating. And it was so prevalent for people to say, I think I'm dead. I heard this from many stories I read. And then all of a sudden they feel pain in their foot, or they realize that their arm is pinned behind them. They go, I guess, well, I'm not dead because I can still feel. Anyway, the story of these 3 women, they were all middle-aged women in their 50s and maybe even in their 60s. They didn't know each other and they were trapped in this situation. And what they did is that they said, we've got to get out of here. And so these women discovered that the 3rd woman had a serious back injury, but they knew it was a matter of life and death. And so they actually helped carry her out. And for those of you, and myself included, that are not from New York, there's so many details I didn't know. One of them is that the Twin Towers is right next to Wall Street. And so these women ran the block or 2 to Wall Street and they're hiding in a store. And then the alarms came on, abandon Wall Street, abandon Wall Street. They're going to probably bomb Wall Street too. It's like, oh my gosh, these women are carrying this woman with a broken back. And so then they take her, and the one woman takes her to her own apartment, 4 blocks, 5 blocks away. They're bathing the woman and they're waiting. And just it was a very common theme. A lot of the stories is that these people did these actions without thinking. It's not like, oh, is this person going to rob me? Who is this person? Oh, is this person, from a different background? Is this person a different political party? No, the ground thing is that the compassion was immediate and 100%. It's like, I'm helping this person, even putting their own lives at risk. And there are dozens of stories like that for the people that went through 9/11. Well, then, and one of the things for those like Nori and some other people and Ken that are familiar with the traditional expression of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism from the Japanese perspective, a lot of times they talk about Amida Buddha being like our mother, that there's this compassion that comes without thinking, like these people in 9/11, that the Buddha grasps us and protects us and does not abandon us. I think for a lot of us in America, maybe that's maybe a sentiment that doesn't translate so much. I actually had a woman say, well, I had a horrible mother, so does that mean Amida's horrible? Like, no, that's not the point, right? And she was Sansei, by the way. So the idea is that compassion, but then when Shinran talks about great compassion, he's talking about the compassion that permeates everything and everyone. So when we talk about Buddha nature, and when we do service at Ekoji on Sunday, and we're doing Oshoko, and then you Oshoko, and then you're bowing to the MAs or the ministers or whoever's done the service, and we know that we're bowing to each other's Buddha nature. It's the same way with the compassion, and the way that Shinran explains it. This compassion is beyond our power. It's beyond our conception. It's something that we try to realize, like Buddha nature, that it's really there. Just like wisdom, we try to realize that there is wisdom that permeates, that we have no control over. And I would just like to briefly read the definition here, because I think it really clarifies what I'm trying to talk about. For those good Shin Buddhists that have their collected works with Shinran Shonin, this is the 2nd volume, which is actually a valuable resource, because what it does is in the first half, it breaks down the chapters of the Kyogyo Shinsho in very readable words, but then the glossary is magic for us that are looking for trying to understand Jodo Shinshu concepts in more detail. And this is what this is the definition from the glossary. And it says, great compassion, which is Dai-hi. It says, according to the Webster's International Dictionary, compassion means to bear with or suffer with another being. It is a deep feeling and uncertainty of understanding of misery and suffering, and the commitment and desire to promote its alleviation, the spiritual consequences of personal tragedy, to help others out of it. So for those that remember the talks that we did during basic Buddhism, and on Sundays, we talk about dualism, and that the Buddha, especially Shakyamuni, talked about the middle path, that we try not to go to one extreme or the other. And I think, as I say to a lot of people, it's one of the basic teachings of Buddhism, and I literally use it every day because it's such a profound idea that we always tend to go from one extreme to the other. But in this context of Shinran Shonin talking about non-dualism, he is talking about that there is no other for us to have compassion for. So the idea is that, that those women that were helping the other women, they're not like saying, I am doing this compassionate deed, that the compassion is already there, like our Buddha nature is already there. So in other words, what Shinran Shonin is talking about, great compassion, is the Buddha's compassion. You could also say it's Amida's compassion, but it's beyond our everyday me and you, our dualistic idea that I am giving you compassion. And I think that those women that survived New York, and fortunately all of them did survive, including the woman that had the extensive back injuries, is that the idea is that at that moment, they were not thinking about me or other. And again, in Buddhism, we try to always talk about the interconnectedness of ourselves, the oneness of all of us. And as a lot of you have heard me say before, one of the metaphors that Shinran loves to talk about is, the ocean, and that how you can look, or a big body of water, a lake, and you can look at the lake and you'll see the waves coming up, the wind blows the waves up, and we're going like that. And, oh, that's Kurt, that's Maya, that's Ron, that's Ken, that's everybody. But then once the wind dies down, we go back into the water of oneness. And that is our natural state that Shinran Shonin is always trying to gently remind us of with these ideas. And one of them is great compassion, this idea that Within us is the Buddha nature. Within us is this great compassion that we already have and we must acknowledge. So for us, maybe in everyday Shen, we talk about, do we have Shinjin or what is entrusting? But one of the things is the other component is this great compassion. And so that's why when we have the statues of the Buddha with the mudras of wisdom and compassion, again, the idea of wisdom is prajna. It's not intellectual wisdom. It is wisdom of the Dharma and to see things as they are. And the compassion, now I hope all of you can think about when we say wisdom and compassion, it's great compassion. And no, the Amida Buddha is not standing there sending it to us, is part of us, our life, and it is part of our everyday existence. We just are not aware of it. So when you think now about when we talk about great compassion or compassion, I hope that you will realize it's like Buddha nature. It's something that's around us and we just are not aware of it. And I think that when we have positive things happen, it's like, we say, I've known some Japanese people that will say things like, that was meant to happen because Amida's great compassion is working through me. And so one of the common things is I had a friend whose Japanese mother, every time that she'd hear an ambulance, she'd put her hands on Gasho because she said that was the voice of Amida calling. That siren is Amida saying that I'm here. This great compassion is always with us. So I hope that this Dharma talk will give you some ideas to think about how the Dharma is constantly surrounding us, not only as a teaching, but also as a great compassion that we are fortunate enough to be able to hear it now in our modern era. So if you could please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats. Okay, before we go on to our discussion group, I'd like to just do a short silent meditation, please. So if you could please join me in meditation. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats.